Up until this point, we've really focused on the CPA's responsibilities under the Code of Conduct. Now we're going to turn the page and start looking at their responsibility under different applicable laws. So first off, we need to distinguish between common law and statutory law. Common law is basically unwritten law that is set by prior precedent, as opposed to statutory law, which is set by legislative rules. So a legislative body such as the U.S. Congress, when they pass a law, we consider that to be statutory law. And we can see that auditors have responsibilities to different parties when they audit financial statements. So their primary responsibility is to their clients. And this is governed the relationship between the auditor and client under the auspices of common law can fall under either contract law or tort law, which we'll talk about both here in detail in a minute. And also the auditor could have liability to third parties, users of the audited financial statements. So we're going to distinguish between primary and other beneficiaries, and these distinctions are very important if a lawsuit is brought against the auditor. Depends on who's relying on this audit information, and we're going to look at how situations are handled under different forms of the law. Now, contract law is basically law that governs agreements, contractual agreements between two parties. You're probably familiar with this term, breach of contract, which occurs anytime one party does not satisfy their duties under a contract. So a couple instances where an auditor could be in breach of contract. First off, if they don't perform the audit in accordance with applicable auditing standards. Right, they're hired to undertake an audit. Let's say for a public company, they're supposed to follow the PCAOB's auditing standards. If they don't follow those standards, they're in breach of contract. Also, if they fail to deliver the audit report by the agreed upon date, this could be a breach of contract as well. Just like any company that produces a good or provides a service, if they don't provide that good or service to their client within the agreed upon time frame, they could potentially have legal liability for that failure to do so. And also violating the confidentiality of a client is another area where a CPA could be held in breach of contract. Now, another area of common law, tort law, oversees any wrongful act that injures another person's property, body, or reputation. And there could be a couple different reasons why we'd have a tort type situation. And the first level is ordinary negligence. This is kind of like the lowest level, least offensive level. Basically, ordinary negligence is just when we fail to exercise a degree of care that an ordinary person would if they were in our shoes. Now notice that's a little bit different than gross negligence. Gross negligence is a higher order, a higher level of offense, and this occurs when there's a failure to use even slight care in circumstances. So performing an audit and taking no care in performing that audit whatsoever. And then the highest level that we have here is fraud, and this really is focused on intentional deception. All right, so if we get sued, particularly by a third party, if our CPA firm gets sued, the type of negligence, all right, that actually occurred is going to be a big factor in determining whether we're legally liable in some situations. Now, one interesting case I want to point out is 1136 Tenants Corporation versus Max Rothenberg and Company. Rothenberg was the CPA in this case. And what happened here, there was kind of a miscommunication. Rothenberg thought they were being hired to compile financial statements, basically meaning they were using the client's source documents to create financial statements. And when they actually created these statements, they marked unaudited on the financial statements, kind of as just a warning, hey, these have been created by us, but they have not been audited. Now, Tenants Corporation was under the impression these were audited financial statements. And basically what happened in the ensuing years, there was an embezzlement from Tenants Corporation. One of their managers embezzled over $100,000. So they felt that Rothenberg had audited their financial statements, whereas Rothenberg felt that wasn't really the case. Now, this was a time before we actually had engagement agreements typically used between CPA firms and clients. So it wasn't quite clearly laid out what Rothenberg's responsibilities were to their clients. So this went to court, and actually the judge found against Rothenberg that they had a failure to inform the client of employee wrongdoings. Basically, Rothenberg uncovered some information during the compilation that they didn't relate back to Tenants Corporation, and because of that, they were found liable. Now, this case is very important because it's kind of set this precedent that in the future, other CPA firms started using engagement letters with clients. And these engagement letters very clearly and in detail laid out the responsibilities between the CPA firm and their audit client. Now, we talked a little bit about auditor responsibility to third parties earlier on, and we need to distinguish between primary beneficiaries and other beneficiaries. So a third party is not privity with the parties in the contract, and privity is just kind of a fancy legal term that says there's a contractual agreement between two parties. So the third party didn't contract the auditor to do the work. They didn't pay the auditor to do the work, but nonetheless, they may be reliant upon the auditor's work for whatever reason. So a primary beneficiary is a third party that's identified to the auditor before the audit begins. So for instance, maybe a company engages an audit, a private company, let's say, engages an auditor to audit their financial statements because they're trying to get a bank loan from XYZ Bank. And let's say XYZ Bank is requiring the company to have audited financial statements before they make a decision on granting the loan. So XYZ Bank is relying directly on these audited financial statements, even though they're not the auditor's client. The auditor's being paid by the client whom they're auditing, and then the client's going to use these audited statements to try to get a bank loan. So that's an example of a primary beneficiary, the bank in that case. Other beneficiaries, this is a category of beneficiaries that the auditor isn't necessarily aware of before they undertake the audit. So maybe an auditor audits a public company's financial statements. There's investors out there at large who are going to rely on those audited statements to make investment decisions. The auditor, of course, can't know of every party in the future that's going to rely on the audited statements. So individuals like this fall under this other beneficiaries bucket. Now, auditors have a couple different common law defenses available to them if they do get sued. The big one that they want to use is they weren't negligent. So if they perform the audit in accordance with professional standards, usually that goes a long way to defending their position. And it's really important that auditors have good documentation of the work they did during the audit. So we'll talk later on in the course about auditors' working papers. But this is one primary reason we want to have that documentation, all right, to have legal protection if we do get sued as a CPA conducting an audit. A couple other possible defenses: no duty of care was owed to the plaintiff. Maybe the plaintiff had no loss. The loss was caused by other events outside the purview of the auditor. Maybe there was negligence on part of the plaintiff, on part of the company that we audited. And also maybe there's a statute of limitations that was exceeded. So all of these are different defenses that the auditor could try to bring up in court if they actually get sued. So the due care defense, that's the primary defense auditors typically use if they do go to court. And this due care defense just shows the auditor did in fact take all the steps necessary to audit the financial statements. And of course, we know that the audited financial statements, they're not going to have perfection. We have reasonable assurance that the audited statements are free of material misstatements. So as long as the auditor can show they've taken the proper steps to come to that opinion, they should be all right. But if there's missing documentation or if they weren't following the professional standards, that's when auditors can get into trouble. Now, we focused on common law so far. I want to start looking at statutory law. We have a number of different statutes that have been put in place that govern auditors' responsibilities. And again, statutory law is the law that's passed by state and federal legislative bodies. And we've talked about a couple of these laws already, the SEC Acts of 1933 and 34, as well as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. I want to go in a little bit more detail and clarify some of the most important points of these particular pieces of statutory law. The first thing I want to look at is the differences between the 1933 and 34 SEC laws that are put in place. Recall the 1933 Act governs IPOs, initial public offerings. So if a company wants to issue shares and sell them to the public for the first time, they're governed by this 1933 Act. So an auditor will audit the financial statements, in this case, prospective statements, which are used then by investors who may be thinking about investing in the IPO. So this graph here, or this table, is kind of telling us the level of reliance on the part of the plaintiff under both of these acts and also the defendant's liability. So let's start off looking at the 1933 Act covering IPOs. The plaintiff under the 1933 Act to be any person acquiring the security. Notice that's a little bit different than the 1934 Act. Remember, the Act of 1934 discussed or revolved around issuing securities at large, where the 1933 Act was really focused on IPOs. So if we're bringing suit against an auditor under the 1934 Act, it's either the buyer or the seller of the security could bring action. All right. In the 1933 Act, it's only the person acquiring the security that could bring action. The plaintiff does not have to prove reliance on the work of the auditor if they bring action under this act. And the defendant is, in fact, liable for ordinary negligence in this case. So going back to the different levels of negligence we've seen under tort law, so they just have to meet the lowest requirement for the plaintiff to actually receive settlement under the 1933 Act. Now, under the 1934 Act, it's a little bit more forgiving for auditors. The plaintiff has to prove reliance on the auditor's work in this case. And also, the defendant liability for ordinary negligence, it has to be a greater level than that. So there has to be fraud or there has to be gross negligence at hand for the plaintiff to win the suit if they're bringing it under the 1934 statute. Now, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977 was another very important piece of legislation that governs some of the laws that companies follow and auditors follow when conducting engagements. One of the big things that came about from this act was it was illegal. It was made illegal to bribe foreign officials, and this doesn't really necessarily affect auditors so much per se, but there were other things in the act that did more directly affect auditors. First off, we established record retention specifications for companies that are trading securities. We also increased the bookkeeping and accounting record requirements of corporations that have to follow the initial 1934 SEC legislation. One other big thing to note from this act is one of the first legislative acts to put a focus on internal control, requiring companies to have internal control in place. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, passed a few decades later, made even a greater focus on internal control.